When you think about the war in Europe, you probably picture tanks, drones, and front lines. But what if I told you the deadliest battlefield of this war wasn't in Europe at all? What if it was thousands of miles away, in the quiet, struggling fields of Africa and Asia? Today we're going to dig into how a conflict in Europe sparked a global fertilizer crisis, one that completely redrew the map of power and pushed millions right to the very edge of starvation. Now that quote, that's not from some UN report or a think tank analyst. That's from a farmer, a man named Justin Malanga in Malawi. He, and millions of others like him, saw this crisis coming not on the news, but in his own soil. His words they cut right to the heart of it, don't they? They ground this huge, complicated global issue in a very stark, very human reality.
Right. So this wasn't a case of the rains failing or some kind of biblical plague. It was something else entirely. How on earth does a war over territory in Europe lead to empty plates in Africa? Well, the answer lies in this kind of invisible chain that connects a gas field in Siberia all the way to a loaf of bread in Nairobi.
Okay, let's get into it. This crisis didn't happen because of one single thing. It was a perfect storm, really. A collision of three massive shocks that all hit the global food system at the exact same time. And the result was a catastrophic collapse in the supply of one of the most vital ingredients for life on this planet: fertilizer.
You see, here's a fundamental truth about our world that most of us don't think about. We literally turn energy into food. Using this famous chemical process, the Haber-Bosch process, we take nitrogen from the air and use a ton of heat and pressure, all powered by natural gas, to create ammonia. And that ammonia is the building block for nitrogen fertilizer. Get this, the cost of that natural gas makes up a staggering 70% of the fertilizer's total production cost.
So here's how all the dominoes fell. First, Europe's energy crisis. As the continent scrambled to find non-Russian gas, prices just went through the roof. It actually became cheaper for these giant European chemical companies to just shut down their plants than to keep making fertilizer. Then, domino number two. Russia, the world's biggest exporter, found its supply chain just seized up. Now, technically, fertilizer wasn't sanctioned, but the banks wouldn't finance the shipments and the insurance companies wouldn't cover the cargo. And then came the final blow. China, watching all this chaos unfold, banned its own exports to protect its own farmers. Just like that, the world was suddenly short millions and millions of tons of nutrients.
And wow, this chart just lays out the result in stark terms. In just 1 year, the global price for fertilizer more than doubled. And we're not talking about a gradual increase here. This was a vertical spike. It was a shockwave that started in European energy markets and slammed into every single farm on the planet. But here's the thing. That shockwave, it didn't hit everyone the same way. What happened next is really a tale of two worlds. It shows how one global crisis can mean two completely different things depending on where you happen to live. For some, it was an annoyance. For others, it was an absolute catastrophe.
Let's put a real number on this to make it sink in. Imagine you're a farmer in Kenya or Nigeria. The bag of fertilizer you used to buy for about $30. Well, suddenly you had to find $90 for that same bag. It tripled almost overnight. Now, for a small-scale farmer, that's not just a dent in your budget, that's an impossible choice. How are you supposed to deal with that?
And this, right here, is the crucial difference. In the West, in the global North, this crisis meant food inflation. Your grocery bill went up. It was annoying, for sure, but for most people, it was manageable. But in the global South, it wasn't about inflation. It was about destruction. Farmers just couldn't afford fertilizer, period. So they had to plant their crops naked, without the nutrients those plants desperately needed to grow.
And here's why that was so incredibly devastating. Farmers in Africa use on average just 20 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare. Compare that to 150 kilograms in Europe. You see, that small amount in Africa isn't a luxury for a bigger harvest. It's the absolute bare minimum. It's the difference between a harvest that can feed your family and a field of dying crops. So when you take that tiny amount away, the effect is disproportionately catastrophic.
The result was something experts began to call a silent famine. And that name is just chillingly accurate. There was no big dramatic drought, no swarms of locusts on the news. It was just millions of tons of food that were never grown. The World Food Program figured that in some parts of Africa, cereal production was cut by as much as half. The nutrients were just too expensive, so the crops simply starved in the ground.
You know what they say, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, so does geopolitics. While the West was totally focused on its own energy problems, Russia and a few other countries saw a massive opportunity. This fertilizer crisis wasn't just a humanitarian disaster. It was a golden chance to build new alliances and redraw the map of global influence.
I mean, picture this scene in Malawi. A Russian chemical company donates 20,000 tons of fertilizer. As it's being celebrated, the Russian national anthem is playing. The flags of both countries are flying, side by side, and Malawi's Minister of Agriculture gets up and calls Russia a true friend. This wasn't just aid, it was theater. It was power politics in action.
And this was all part of a very clear strategy, a playbook, really. Russia launched this aggressive campaign of what you could call fertilizer diplomacy. They offered discounts to friendly nations. They sent these highly publicized free donations to countries in crisis. And all the while, they pushed a simple, very powerful narrative. The West and its sanctions are starving you. Russia is here to feed you. The goal was simple: lock in political support and neutrality from nations that, frankly, couldn't afford to say no.
But hey, Russia wasn't the only one playing this game. With supplies from Russia and China suddenly unreliable, the whole world turned its eyes to another giant, Morocco. You see, Morocco controls over 70% of the entire planet's reserves of phosphate, another key fertilizer ingredient. All of a sudden, Morocco became the Saudi Arabia of fertilizer, using that new leverage to win friends and influence across Africa.
So you might be thinking, okay, the worst of the price spike is over, things are getting back to normal, right? Well, not so fast. This crisis has cast a very, very long shadow. The damage done to the soil, to global trade, and international trust, we're going to be feeling that for years. And it's forcing a major rethink about the very foundations of our food security.
What's so important to understand is that some of this damage is permanent, or at least very long-term. When a farmer plants naked for a couple of seasons, it's not just about that one bad harvest. Think of soil like a bank account. They've been making withdrawals without any deposits. They've literally mined the soil of its nutrients, and it's going to take years and years of investment to build that natural capital back up.
We're also seeing this huge policy shift towards something called food nationalism. This crisis was a brutal lesson for governments everywhere. If you can't feed your own people, you can be overthrown. Food is now seen as a core national security issue, part of the kill chain, which is a military term. And so countries are hoarding nutrients, they're slapping on export bans, and they're subsidizing their own production, all of which threatens the global free trade system that has fed the world for decades. But is there a way out of this cycle? Is there a path forward? Well, for Africa, the long-term solution might literally be buried right under its own feet. The continent is sitting on vast, untapped reserves of natural gas, the key ingredient we talked about for nitrogen fertilizer. The thinking is, if they can build their own fertilizer industry powered by their own energy, they could finally break this cycle of dependency and achieve real food sovereignty.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty unsettling thought. For a century, we've worried about wars over oil. But this crisis has taught us a vital lesson. You can, with a lot of difficulty, run an economy without oil. You absolutely cannot run a human body without food. Europe survived its energy war, but the bill was paid by the empty fields and the hungry people of the global south. And it raises this very sobering question. Maybe the next great resource war won't be fought over oil at all, but over the basic chemical elements of life itself.